A bridge too far, the 82nd Airborne crossing the Val. After the 1944 Normandy landings, the Western Allies broke through the German defenses, retaking large areas of captured territory. By late summer, High Command devised a new operation, one that could potentially end the war before Christmas. Dubbed Operation Market Garden, the offensive was a combined airborne and armored operation. The British 1st Airborne Division, the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop over strategic locations in the Netherlands to secure important bridges, while the British 30th Corps would advance, crossing over the captured bridges and entering Germany from the north. The 82nd Airborne Division, under the command of Brigadier General James Gavin, was, among other objectives, to secure the bridges that span the Val River at the city of Nijmegen, a rail bridge and a road bridge. During the German advance across the Low Countries, the bridges were destroyed, but were repaired by German engineers. It was vital for the success of Market Garden that these structures be captured intact. On September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden commenced. After landing, the paratroopers rushed to secure their objectives. Zing the approaching 82nd, Germans destroyed several smaller canal bridges, though at least one was captured. They then made a push towards Nijmegen and the vital bridges there, but were delayed, preparing for a rumored 1,000 panzers in a nearby forest, which proved to be untrue. When they entered the city, the Americans were greeted as liberators by the inhabitants, but celebrations were cut short when the Germans counterattacked. The German commander, General Walter Model, had sent reinforcements in the form of the 10th Panzer SS Division to keep the bridge out of Allied hands. A fierce battle ensued, and with the German reinforcements, the 82nd Airborne would be unable to capture the objective. They needed the support of the British Armed Forces, though the plan for Market Garden necessitated that the bridges be captured before they arrived. On September 19th, armored units from the Household Cavalry arrived at Nijmegen, and a conference between General Gavin and General Brian Horrocks occurred. It was concluded that a frontal assault on the bridge would be too costly. Instead, Gavin proposed what sounded like madness. Both the north and the south sides of the bridge would be attacked simultaneously, with a combined attack by British tanks and American paratroopers. The biggest hurdle, however, was that the Allied forces were on the south side of the Wall River, a 400-yard-wide tributary of the Rhine with a swift current. As a solution, Gavin proposed that the paratroopers cross the river by boat about a mile downstream, attacking the Germans on the north side of the bridge at the same time as the main assault from the south. Skeptical, but without an alternative, Horrocks agreed to the plan, which was scheduled for the next day, September 20. At around 8:30 the next morning, the Allies launched the attack, the first objective being the securing of Nijmegen on the south side of the river. While this was underway, the 3rd Battalion 504th Regiment prepared for their amphibious operation, covered by Sherman tanks from the Irish Guard and artillery from the Leicestershire Yeomanry. The plan ran into complications almost immediately. Reinforcements from the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, scheduled to arrive, were delayed due to poor weather at their base in Britain, depriving them of much-needed manpower. Furthermore, the boats needed for the mission were provided by British engineers, but these were slow in arriving, since Hell's Highway, the thin artery of supply, was a narrow roadway, with constant jams and destroyed vehicles obstructing the flow of traffic, and the boats arrived late. When they did arrive, the paratroopers were underwhelmed, to say the least. made from canvas and plywood, something more suited for fishing in a leisurely pond than conducting an amphibious operation on one of Europe's largest rivers. Nevertheless, the 3rd Battalion set up the boats, 13 men plus 3 engineers each, and began the crossing. As the men slid into the water, the tanks, supported by artillery, began to provide covering fire, launching smoke screens to cover the paratroopers. In addition, a flight of 8 RAF Typhoon fighters strafed the north bank in anticipation of the landing. In spite of these preparations, disaster struck. The men were paratroopers, not Marines, and had little experience with waterborne operations. The overloaded boats became bogged down in the muddy banks and were difficult to dislodge. Others pushed their boats out into deeper water to keep from getting mired, climbing in after. But many capsized and had to be righted, while the swift current of the ball caused some boats to drift out of control. Eventually, enough boats were able to begin the crossing in earnest. But the smoke screen had dissipated more quickly than had been hoped, and the Germans on the far bank opened fire with machine guns and mortars. Major Julian Cook, leader of the 3rd Battalion, was in the lead boat. A devout Catholic, he prayed the rosary with each stroke of his paddle, the tempo of his prayer setting the pace for the rest of his men with him. The effectiveness of this improvised sea shanty was limited by the lack of paddles. The men improvised using the butts of their rifles, their hands, anything to get across. With such floundering targets, German machine guns, tanks, and mortars began picking off the struggling paratroopers, blasting the canvas boats with everything they had in their arsenals. Hulls were torn into the flimsy hulls, and the survivors used their helmets to bail out the onrushing water and stuff cloth into the leaks in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Of the 26 boats to make the first trip, only 11 made back to the southern shore for the second wave. Those that didn't make it across still had major obstacles in their way. The main German position was a dike on the far end of a 1,200-foot wide field. After catching their breath, the men fixed bayonets and charged. There was a brief firefight with the few Germans there, clearing this defensive strongpoint. While this was going on, the rest of the battalion made their crossing. With the bulk of the 3rd Battalion on the north side of the vault, they made their way to the railroad bridge. After destroying several German positions, the north end of the rail bridge was secured. More intense fighting would ensue, but eventually, the northern portion of the vault bridge would also be captured. At the same time, Nijmegen was steadily being captured by the British armed forces and American paratroopers, who sometimes fought from rooftop to rooftop. By the evening, both ends of the bridge were in Allied hands. The SS tried to destroy the span with place demolition charges, but these failed to explode. It's alleged that Jan van Hoof, a member of the Dutch resistance, had disabled the charges days earlier, though this is impossible to confirm. British tanks were now able to cross the Val River. Their objective, the city of Arnhem, about 10 miles away, where elements of the British 1st Airborne and 1st Polish Parachute Brigade were being pressed by a German counterattack. Instead of moving onward to relieve them, however, the British tanks dug in, having been ordered to halt the bridge at all costs, and no further instructions to race to Arnhem were issued. Due to a combination of factors ranging from the approaching night, the arrival of German reinforcements, logistical issues, and pockets of German resistance in the Nijmegen area, the push towards Arnhem was delayed. When they heard about this, the paratroopers were enraged, having performed the crossing in broad daylight, sacrificing their lives under the impression that every moment counted, instead of waiting for darkness. During the crossing and subsequent fighting, 134 men of 3rd Battalion and their attached engineers were killed, wounded, or missing, more than half the unit. There was little they could do, however, except fortify their holdings and await further instruction. Eventually, after a few more days of fighting, it was determined that Arnhem was too difficult to hold on to, and that the Allies should consolidate their front line around Nijmegen, the paratroopers at Arnhem breaking south towards their allies. Although still hotly debated to this day, ranging from the 82nd, failing to capture the bridges before the tanks arrived, the failure to push to Arnhem, logistics and communication breakdowns, weather and other reasons, Operation Market Garden wasn't ultimately a failure. In spite of this, the memory of the heroic men who fought lives on. 40 years after the battle, a monument honoring those who fell was erected. In 2013, a third bridge across the wall was dedicated, called it the Overstig or the Crossing. It has 48 lights, one for each man who fell trying to reach a bridge too far.